Well, welcome again, everyone. Again, I'm a little hoarse right now, so if I sound a little strange, that's to be expected, I suppose. Hopefully we'll get through this okay. I was thinking about the Israelites who at one time were slaves in Egypt. They were not free back then. They were forced to do whatever the Egyptians told them to do. We know that our God led them out of their bondage and into freedom, freedom to worship the one true God. No longer were they slaves doing whatever their masters demanded of them. So what about people today? Are people today in bondage or slavery? Well, sadly, there are some who are victims of human trafficking and other forms of actual slavery. That's very sad, but that's not really what I'm talking about. Let's take just the United States, although I'd say this applies to the entire world. But is possibly a large percentage of the population of the United States in any kind of bondage or slavery today. You might be saying, no, I don't think so. But I feel like that I was in bondage at one time. And just like those Israelites, I believe God brought me out of my bondage. Let me explain. When I was a young man, I didn't have a lot of money. I had to work hard and save to get by. It was about all I could do to make ends meet. But then I ran into some unexpected expenses as I became an adult. I didn't think about this, but at Christmas time, I was expected to buy all my friends and family presents. Presents I really could not afford. On Valentine's Day, if I was dating someone, I was expected to buy them flowers and candy. On Easter, it was Easter baskets and chocolate bunnies and maybe an egg coloring kit. And on Halloween, I needed to purchase large amounts of candy for the dozens of children that came by expecting it. Now, all these purchases were due to traditions I was taught as a child. I used to always wonder where these traditions came from and why I felt I just had to spend money on these things, even though I didn't necessarily want to. I felt I didn't have a choice not to participate in them. We might say that I was a slave to these traditions. Didn't want to do them, but I felt I had to. So who came up with all these traditions? And who has the authority to compel us to make these purchases for certain days of the year? And for that matter, why were we even observing these holidays in the first place? Well, it seems that many of these things were taught to me by my church when I was young. For example, I was told that Christmas was the birthday of Christ. Now later, I learned that wasn't true, but originally I just assumed that Christmas was Christ's birthday. I was told that we were supposed to give gifts to others because the wise men gave gifts to the baby Jesus. But the wise men gave gifts to their king, not to each other. So I wondered why we were supposed to give gifts to each other rather than give our gifts to our king. I was told that Easter marks the anniversary of Jesus' resurrection. Well, I discovered later that that wasn't true either. But whether true or not, that still didn't explain the bunny rabbits and the Easter eggs, or why we should color eggs or make up baskets with fake grass, chocolate bunnies, and maybe some marshmallow peeps. Again, as a young child, I read my Bible to see if I could find these traditions there. Since it was the church that taught these things, I assumed that these things must have come from the Bible, but as we know, they weren't there. I did find an example of gift exchanges in the Bible, though. Let's turn to Revelation chapter 11, if you would. Revelation chapter 11, verse 8. We were just talking about the two witnesses, I think, and this relates to them, but Revelation 11, verse 8, here this speaks of a time in the future when the two witnesses of God will appear. But people in general won't like what they have to say. People at that time will much prefer their sin to the righteous ways of God. And for speaking for God, these two witnesses will be killed and left in the street in Jerusalem for people to look upon their dead bodies. People will then rejoice because they will no longer have to listen to the word of God from his two witnesses, at least as far as they think anyway. They can, once again, they believe, relax and enjoy their sin. Again, in Revelation 11, verse 8. Speaking of the two witnesses. And their dead bodies shall lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, which also our Lord was crucified. And they of the people, in kindreds and tongues and nations, shall see their dead bodies 3 days and a half, and shall not suffer their dead bodies to be put into graves. They won't be allowed burial. Verse 10, and they that dwell upon the earth shall rejoice over them, and make merry, and shall send gifts one to another, because these two prophets tormented them that dwelt on the earth. Well, in the future, people opposed to God, and of course to his two witnesses, will party. They will rejoice when the two witnesses are killed, and they will exchange gifts with each other. But I seriously doubt that any of us will be rejoicing when God's two witnesses are killed. We won't be sending gifts to each other and celebrating the death of God's prophets either. Those that do, I'd say certainly they would not be God's people. But gift exchanges didn't just start with Christmas. From an article on ChristmasThisYear.com, the origin of gift exchanges, I'll quote, the act of gift-giving is believed to start in ancient Rome as part of the Saturnalia festival, which paid tribute to the Roman god Saturn. The Romans celebrated the winter solstice on December 17th, although they did more than just exchange gifts. They also celebrated with festivals and partied until December 23rd in an attempt to exert control over the people. I find that interesting, considering we're talking about bondage and slavery today. People exerting control over others. Let's continue. The Roman Emperor Domitian changed the celebration date from December 25th, sometime between AD 81 and 96. And when Christianity was made legal in Rome in the first half of the 4th century AD, some practices of the Saturnalia festival, like gift-giving, eventually became associated with Christmas. Soon after that, Pope Julius decided that Jesus' birthday would fall on December 25th, although no one knows the exact date of his birth. In any case, that's why we celebrate Christmas on December 25th, and that's also why we exchange gifts during Christmas, end quote. So back to my question. Why did I feel so compelled to buy and exchange gifts on December 25th? Well, it's because the worship of the Roman god Saturn had established the tradition of exchanging gifts among the people. The article I read claims that the traditions of Christmas, such as gift exchanges, were done by the Romans, in part at least, to exert control over the people, which is kind of what's happening today. Pope Julius declared December 25th to be Christ's birthday, but adopted the celebrations and the traditions of the worship of the false god Saturn. So, over 1,000 years later, I found myself compelled to buy and exchange gifts with others due to the traditions of worshiping the false god Saturn. A tradition that began thousands of years ago and was later adopted by Christians when Pope Julius said so. And that's why I just had to buy all those presents for everyone. Even today, churches continue to promote this tradition, although it has nothing to do with Christ, and of course everything to do with the worship of a false god. And what about Easter? Why are so many of us today compelled to purchase Easter baskets, chocolate bunny rabbits, or chocolate eggs? The name Easter, of course, refers to an ancient goddess, and like most goddesses, Easter is a fertility goddess. The symbols of her worship include the rabbit, which is said to be a very fertile animal, and also eggs are a symbol of fertility. Of course, I didn't find anything in my Bible about these traditions either, since these Christian traditions didn't come from Christianity at all, but rather in this case from the worship of a false goddess. Nevertheless, most Christians today feel compelled to purchase these Easter baskets, candy rabbits and eggs, and again, even those marshmallow peeps. Of course, Christmas comes in December. That was a couple of months ago. Easter will be coming up next month on March 31st this year. But we're currently in the month of February. Is there anything people feel compelled to spend money on this month? Any ideas? Yes, well, of course, that would be St. Valentine's Day. Stores today are full of heart-shaped boxes of candy, decorations, T-shirts, gift cards, you name it. all for purchase for our Valentine. The things we're compelled to do, they're out there. But why do we feel that we simply must buy our girlfriends or perhaps our spouses something on this specific day of the year? Where did this tradition come from? Why are we compelled to do this? I could make a side trip here. I remember St. Valentine's Day when I was in grade school. Now, I can remember getting little candy hearts with saying on them. They said things like, "Be my Valentine." Did you ever get those in school? But what does it really mean to be someone's Valentine? No one ever explained that to me. But I clearly recall our teacher writing down all the names of the girls in our class on a small strip of paper. These little strips of paper were folded and then placed in a container. Now, next, I remember all the boys, including me, all the boys in my class randomly drew one of these strips of paper from the container. They each unfolded their strip of paper to reveal a girl's name. Okay. Well, this girl was then to become the Valentine of the boy who drew her name. But I wondered, what does that mean? What was I supposed to do at this point? Again, we were never told. What was the purpose of pairing up the boys and girls to be each other's Valentine on Valentine's Day? That drove me crazy for years, and we'll get to the reason why shortly. We'll let you know. But again, Valentine's Day is not found anywhere in our Bibles. Like most of our traditions today, unfortunately, the modern observance of Valentine's Day has its origin with the worship of false gods. In this case, it was an ancient Roman festival called the Feast of Lupercalia. I'd like to quote part of an article from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Hang on one second. This is the Encyclopedia Britannica, quote, "Lupercalia, ancient Roman festival that was conducted annually on February 15 under the superintendence of a corporation of priests called Luperci. The origins of the festival are obscure, although the likely derivation of its name from lupus, Latin meaning wolf, has variously suggested connection with an ancient deity who protected herds from wolves and with the legendary she-wolf who nursed Romulus and Remus, if you recall them. As a fertility rite, the festival is also associated with the god Faunus. East Lupercalia began with a sacrifice by the Luperci of goats and a dog, after which two of the Luperci were led to the altar. Their foreheads were touched with a bloody knife, and the blood was wiped off with wool dipped in milk. The ritual required that the two young men laugh. Strange. The sacrificial feast followed, after which the Luperci cut thongs from the skins of the sacrificial animals and ran in two bands around the Palatine Hill, striking with the thongs at any woman who came near them. Can you imagine that scene? Strips of, dog and goat hide, and these priests are, striking women who came by them. Let me continue on, sorry. A blow from the thong was supposed to render a woman fertile. That was the point. In 494 CE, the Christian church under Pope Gelasius I appropriated the form of the rite, Lupercalia, as the Feast of the Purification, end quote. Now, why was it called the Feast of the Purification? We'll find out in just a minute. We're going to answer some of these questions. The Lupercalia was a pagan fertility festival. Women presented themselves naked or nearly naked to be hit by the thongs wielded by the Luperci priests in the hope of ensuring their fertility. Now, from Christ Our Truth website, located at sites.google.com, regarding this festival, quote, "The color red became sacred to this day because of the blood sacrificed and the blood purification from the whips. Mass nakedness and animal sacrifice was also carried out on this day. The Luperci priest would gather all the people together in a cave on Palatine Hill." Close quote. Let me stop here just a second. We're back into it. But recall just a minute ago that I was very puzzled as to why the boys back in grade school drew girls' names out of a container to become their Valentines. Remember? I said, what's the purpose of this? Well, note what comes up next in this quote. Let me get back to this. Let's get back to the article. Continue on with this about the Feast of Lupercalia. Here's the next quote. Quote, they would put billets, small pieces of paper, with the names of women written on them in a large box called an urn. Whichever name the men picked out of that box, that person would be their partner for the next year. This is where the concept of dating comes from. Erotic games and wild orgies were celebrated throughout Rome. Close quote. So on February 14th, the day before the 15th, which was the actual beginning of the fertility festival, the names of young women would be placed into an urn or container. The young men would take turns drawing a name from that urn. And that's exactly what we did back in grade school. Exactly. I just didn't know why. The young man and the young girl whose name he drew from the container would be a couple for the Feast of Lupercalia and really for the coming year. In modern terms, they would be each other's Valentines. Now, what did it mean to the Romans back then? Why did they do that? Well, to be more explicit, these couples, these Valentines, were encouraged to be sexual partners during the festival and for the coming year, which of course makes sense. After all, the festival of the Lupercalia was a fertility festival. On the 14th day of February, the young women were paired up with the young men to be ready for the fertility festival that began the next day on the 15th. And on that day, as we said, the 15th of February, the priest, called Luperci, would then strike the women with the cut thongs from the skins of the sacrificed animals in a ceremony said to ensure their fertility. So you know what's coming up next, right, with these couples. It's kind of obvious. Now, here's a question for you. You've been listening the last couple of years. What were those strips of goat and dog hide called? The ones they pull those strips off, they would beat the women with them to ensure fertility. What were those strips called they hit the women with? Remember? They were called februa. And this festival was sometimes called the Festival of the Februa. I'll get it right. Which is, of course, where the month of February gets its name. That was exciting to find that out. I didn't know what that was all about. So the next question is, why was the date of February 15th chosen for the actual festival to begin? Well, the false god Tammuz, also known to the Romans as Cupid, was said to be born on January 6th in early Roman times. Now, that date was later changed to December 25th, we all know. But early on, it was January 6th. Now, it was a custom of women in those days to present themselves for purification 40 days after giving birth. We may be familiar with that tradition. 40 days after January 6th, the alleged birthday of Cupid, would be, you may have guessed it, February 15th, the date of the festival of the Lupercalia. But the day before, of course, was the 14th, and that was when the couples were actually paired up for the coming fertility festival the next day. So what does this all really have to do with St. Valentine's Day? Well, from History.com, quote, in truth, the exact origins and identity of St. Valentine are unclear. According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, at least 3 different St. Valentines, all of them martyrs, are mentioned in the early martyrologies under the date of 14 February. One was a priest in Rome, the second was a bishop in Interamna, Italy, and the third St. Valentine was a martyr in the Roman province of Africa. Legends vary on how the martyr's name became connected with romance. The date of his death may have become mingled with the Feast of Lupercalia, a pagan festival of love. On these occasions, the names of young women were placed in a box from which they were drawn by the men as chance directed. Where have you heard that before? In 496 AD, Pope Gelasius decided to put an end to the Feast of Lupercalia. He decided that February 14th be celebrated as St. Valentine's Day. End quote. So basically, the church renamed this pagan festival Lupercalia to St. Valentine's Day, choosing for the date the time when the young men and women were paired up to be couples for the next year. Hopefully, fertile couples. I'm not sure about marriage here. So, where did little Cupid come from? I'm sure you remember Cupid. You're familiar with Cupid, that winged, baby-like character that's seen shooting an arrow into a heart. Get it backwards. Okay. Mythology tells us that Cupid is the son of the Roman goddess of love and beauty. That would be Venus. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about how these false gods and goddesses seem to come from the same source. They're just different versions of in different cultures. Cupid is the Roman culture's version of Tammuz. Same false god, just a different name. The father of Cupid was Jupiter in the Roman culture, but Jupiter was the counterpart of Nimrod in a different culture. Cupid, or Tammuz if we prefer, like his father Jupiter or Nimrod, was also a mighty hunter. And like Nimrod, he used a bow and arrow. So Cupid is also known for his bow and arrow. Additional research reveals that Cupid was known as the get it back. Let me try this again. I'm having a rough time today. Excuse me. Additional research reveals that Cupid was known as the Lord of Love and Fertility. Does that sound familiar? Remember, the Lupercalia was a fertility festival. Roman mythology also tells us that a person will have an uncontrollable sexual desire if shot by Cupid's arrow. But what about our modern Valentine's Day? What about that? Drawing random names from a container to pair up couples as Valentines, just like we did in high school. Grade school make that. Cupid shooting arrows at hearts. In actuality, those hearts, if we really look at this, they really represent a very different part of the female anatomy than we might have first come to mind. And those arrows allegedly cause the Valentine to have uncontrollable sexual desires. I think back and often wonder if my grade school teachers actually understood the original reason that the girls and boys were paired together on the 14th of February, what we now call Valentine's Day. I sincerely hope not. Hope they didn't really understand that. I'm thinking they didn't. Let's hope not. But the customs of Valentine's Day clearly originated with the festival and worship of the false gods of early Rome. Now, today, do we believe the strips of sacrificed animal hide will make a woman more fertile? Do we really believe that somehow being shot by Cupid's arrow will cause us to have uncontrollable desires? Well, probably not. I don't think we believe these things anymore. So, why do so many people feel compelled to observe this day each year? Why is it such a big day? Well, primarily it's because of those who want to cash in on these traditions. Come each February, we're inundated with ads telling us we need to buy cards or flowers or candy or something for Valentine's Day. But why is this? Well, it's because those who sell merchandise want to make money. They don't want these traditions to go away. They very actively promote Valentine's Day, as well as the other holidays like Christmas and Easter. It's all about sales. If we stop and think about it, practically all these holidays are about us getting something or spending money to get things. At Halloween, the children look forward to getting candy, right? We used to buy lots of candy. At Christmas, it's toys for the children and gifts for the adults. At Easter, it's Easter egg baskets containing candy. And on Valentine's Day, it's about getting something else that might be desirable. Could be flowers, candy, or other gifts. Gifts that might just convince someone of the opposite sex to be our Valentine. And that's really the focus of most of the holidays so many Christians observe today. Purchasing treats for others and receiving treats or gifts in return. These holidays are perpetrated by those who sell candy and gifts and things like that. They're the ones that push these things. And of course, sadly, it's promoted even by the churches themselves. But these are holidays, not holy days. What about God's true holy days? Do they come with the promise of candy and gifts? Things that are, well, in the end, really of very little value, right? Most of our candy and gifts are gone before you know it. No, they don't. They come with the assurance of eternal life, and the assurance that indeed God is not willing that any should perish. They come with assurance that's much greater than all those earthly gifts and trinkets that people deal with on these holidays. So why are God's true holy days not promoted like all those holidays are? Why don't we hear about that? Well, probably the main thing is there's no money in it, right? Many of the world's holidays require us to purchase things to give to each other. The retailers like that. But God's holy days only ask us to give to Him. To give Him our attention. To give Him our time. To give Him our devotion. No candy or treats required. So, how can the retailers make money on that? Well, they can't. How often have we seen ads on television or radio promoting the Day of Atonement, God's 5th annual holy day? Or about God's last great day? Well, you'll never see that because there's no money in it for them. It's all about money. That's that's what keeps it going, I should say. I'll get it out. But to make matters worse, many churches fall into this same trap, promoting the pagan holidays, but saying nothing about the true holy days found in our Bibles and declared by our great Creator. Let's turn to John, if you would, for me. John chapter 8. John chapter 8, verse 31. Let's look at some scriptures here. That's John chapter 8 and verse 31. So I think that probably many of us, I know me in the past included, have felt pressured into buying things for these holidays because we were told to. And I believe in some ways we had become slaves to marketing and peer pressure. How can we free ourselves from the expectations of these holidays of non-biblical origin? What does Christ have to say? Again, let's look at John chapter 8 and verse 31. What Jesus had to say. Then said Jesus to those Jews which believed on him, "If you continue in my word, then are you my disciples indeed." We might note the if-then condition here. The contemporary English version reads, "If you keep on obeying what I have said," in other words, keeping his commandments, "you are truly my disciples." Verse 32. "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Yeah. Once we know the truth, the real truth, not the fairy tales, the truth will set us free. There can be a lot said about what Jesus proclaimed here in John 8, verse 32. But I fear that many of us have become slaves of these traditions that have no relationship to our Creator. Rather, relationships with false gods whom we're told not to associate with. Whether we realize it or not, that's what we're doing. When I learned the origin of many of these holidays that I used to keep, such as Valentine's Day, it was actually a great relief for me. I actually did feel free. No longer was I a slave to these holidays, feeling compelled to buy certain things at certain times of the year for what was to me some completely unknown reason at the time. I didn't know why I was doing it, so why was I doing it? It's crazy. I was feeling obligated to do something on a specific day to perhaps prove my love for someone. That's what these gifts are all about, right? But if we have to be reminded to demonstrate our love for someone just on certain days of the year, how impressive is that anyway? To do so only because we feel obligated, right? We're pressured into it. Now, is there anything wrong with expressing our love for someone, or maybe buying them something to do that? Maybe flowers or candy? Or maybe taking them out for a special evening? Is something wrong with that? No, not at all. And especially, I'd say, if we do it as a voluntary expression of our love rather than an obligation. An obligation originating with the worship of pagan deities and their associated fertility festivals. I'll tell you a little story here, true story. I was checking out at a store a while back. I think it was a grocery store. Anyway, the only item I had to buy was a bouquet of flowers. That was it. The young woman at the register asked me if it was my anniversary. It's your anniversary? I said, no. Your wife's birthday, maybe? No, it wasn't. And it wasn't Valentine's Day either. Now, obviously perplexed, she asked, so what's the occasion? I said, well, I don't think there really is an occasion. I just wanted to remind my wife that I love and care about her. That was it. If we only do things for our loved ones on special occasions when we're obligated and expected to do it, what about the rest of the year? Besides, how much more meaningful is it to express our love for someone when we're not obligated or told to do so? Now, that to me would indicate sincerity, to do it when we don't have to, right? If we're fulfilling an obligation, does that really prove anything, Let me finish my story. As I began to walk away with my flowers, the young lady at the register said in a slightly disgusted voice, I couldn't help but hear, I had to laugh. She said, my boyfriend never brings me anything unless it's Valentine's Day or my birthday. I had to laugh. Well, I might not be very popular with her boyfriend for this, but anyway, she wasn't too happy when she realized that's the only time she ever got anything was these holidays that were obligations. Well, I also believe that it's very important to note that if we wish to demonstrate our love for someone, we need to know what would actually make that person feel loved. If you think about it, some could actually be allergic to flowers or even chocolate, and that'd be bad. But then if we really and truly know and love that person, we'd be aware of that. We'd know them. We'd know what they need. We know what they like. We would know best how to please that person and express our love in a way that is meaningful to them. Would you agree? In other words, our loved ones, we should know them. We should know them well enough to know what makes them feel loved and what doesn't. Would you agree? Okay, good. So what about our expression of our love to God? If it's important to express our love to others, isn't it also important to express our love to God? In fact, that's God's greatest commandment for us. It's the greatest commandment, to love Him. We can read that in Mark 12, verse 30, by the way. And if we know and truly love God, then we should know how He wants to be loved. Does He want flowers or chocolates or Valentines? Let's turn to John 14, if you would. John 14, verse 15. That's John 14, verse 15. So if we want to express our love to God in a way that He would appreciate it and understand it and welcome it, for example, what would Jesus Christ say if we ask Him how He would like us to express our love for Him? How would He ask it? If we ask Him that question, what would He say? Well, I don't think we have to ask Him because He already gave us the answer in John 14, verse 15. So John 14, verse 15, Here Jesus tells us very simply, if you love me, keep my commandments. Jesus tells us that if we love Him, He wants us to keep His commandments. That's what makes Him happy. That's what makes Him feel loved. Commandments that tell us to avoid following the customs of those who follow false gods, and instead keep the commandments of the one true God, including His holy days that we read about in Leviticus 23, for example. God's declared holy days that so many have forsaken in favor of the pagan deities and customs that God detests. God's real holy days that show us His love for us and the great plan He has for all of us. If we're truly followers of Jesus Christ, shouldn't we be showing our love to Him in the way that pleases Him and not in the way that we know it doesn't? We can be led around by the world as they celebrate modernized versions of ancient pagan fertility festivals, often dressed up in an attempt to hide their original intentions, or we can follow Jesus Christ. Like the Egyptians that were freed from their bondage, let's allow Christ to set us free from observing these pagan traditions. Instead, let's follow His ways and his festivals, his holy days that have real meaning and show our love to him in the way he desires, the way Jesus asks us to, not in the way the world tells us that we should. It's up to each of us to decide what our relationship will be like with our loved ones, our neighbors, and with our great Savior and friend, Jesus Christ. Will we love Christ as he asks us to do? Or will we defer to the world's pagan ways and to the festivals and the days considered holy to the worshipers of other false gods and goddesses? Now, of course, it's up to each one of us to decide that. Let's turn to Acts 5, verse 29 to end today. That's Acts chapter 5 and verse 29. Acts chapter 5, verse 29. And here the high priest and the chief priest were giving Peter and some of the apostles a hard time over speaking the truth. That happened a lot. People don't like to hear the truth, you know. I really like the answer that they gave back to the high priest. And I believe their response is also very good advice for us. So let's end the day with Acts 5, verse 29. It says, in response to those priests, "Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, 'We ought to obey God rather than men.'" I could not agree more. Let's reject the ungodly traditions of men, traditions that have found their ways into the worship of false gods. Let's no longer be slaves to these traditions, being compelled to do whatever these pagan traditions dictate, as many feel like today. But now that we know the truth shall set us free.